foremost want to thank the Islamic Society of Britain for inviting me and hosting this webinar. I know that this is a topic that is a hot one in the Muslim context. And I feel that people need some kind of answers. So for the past 3-4 years, I've been looking at this topic quite extensively. It's my bread and butter in terms of my research. And alhamdulillah, inshallah, there'll be a book coming out on this with my findings. So what I'm about to share with you is a very, introductory conversation to what is a very large conversation in of itself. And there are many aspects of the whole thing. So I do appreciate that there are some things that might be simplified, but hopefully the panelists will be sharing some resources that they will keep sharing throughout this conversation. So one is a conference that we did last year, and the other one is a short 6-page document that I wrote that introduces the field of Islam and evolution to absolutely anybody in a language that is accessible to anybody. So do look out for those, inshallah. So having said that, let's begin, inshallah. Right. So this is the overview of today's conversation. Just one second. I have a bit of an issue with this Zoom software. Oh, sorry. Oh, come on. There you go. Right. So yeah. So this is the overview for today. And I'm going to primarily go over these 4 things. Number 1, just to briefly introduce the discussion. What is the big controversy? Why is Islam and evolution such a hot topic? Where are the areas from which Muslims are coming from and finding this a very contentious issue? So that's what I want to kind of start off with in the beginning. The second thing is, and in my experience, Islam and evolution is an interdisciplinary problem, right? You cannot just approach it from just a scientific perspective. You can't approach it just from a Quran and Hadith perspective. You need to have all of these discussions in front of you to be able to make sense in how you need to navigate this field. And for that reason, I find it very beneficial to divide it into these 3 parts: science, metaphysics or philosophy and theology, and scripture. And this is how I'll kind of break it down for the purposes of this webinar. Then we'll look at, the spectrum of opinions. So in my own research, I've at least uncovered 28 distinctive positions that people have on the spectrum. So some people totally reject it, some people totally accept it, and then some people are in between. And the take-home message is something that I'll conclude with after we review everything, inshallah. All right. Feel free to throw your questions. I think the panelists have sent their viewers emails, so you can see how how we can how we're planning this webinar. So we have question zones. So please feel free to ask your questions in those designated slots, right? You can question anytime. And what the panelists are going to do, they'll be collating these questions. And when the time comes, hopefully they'll be shooting them at me one by one. So let's start off. Bismillah. What is the big controversy, right? In very simple terms, evolution is a scientific theory that attempts to explain how all of us are biologically connected. Initially, this is like maybe before Charles Darwin. So this is before 1850s. People generally thought that we were just created poof, just like that, right? So animals are created instantaneously, humans were created instantaneously. And that was the general narrative that existed. Then came Charles Darwin, and he was not the first person to come up with the theory of evolution. There were many before him. But he said, hang on, we can actually explain where our biodiversity comes from using evolution. And basically, he says that all of us are connected like a family tree. So you know how you have a mother and father, your parents have a mother and father, they have a mother and father, and so on and so on and so on. Evolution just goes one step further. They're basically saying that all of us are products of species that existed before us, right? So we came from a pre-human species. That species came from another species all the way back. And if you rewind the clock enough, you eventually get back to the first life form, which would be the cell or what have you. So fundamentally, we all have biological descent. That is the primary message of evolution, okay? That all of us, we are connected by a biological lineage. We share that history and we share that biology with everyone else. Muslims generally have thought that Adam is a miraculous creation, right? That he was created instantaneously and by extension humans. And therefore, this conflicts immediately with what evolution is telling us. So that's the starting point of this conversation. So you have evolution telling you that all of us are biologically connected. Humans are not anything special in that sense. But the Quran and Hadith are telling us that Adam was, a miraculous creation, and humans by extension are not a product of evolution. So that's where this friction starts off. Okay, now the problem here is that most people unfortunately see this as a bifurcation. Now, a bifurcation simply means you treat this as one or the other option, and there's no room in between. So these are the options that people usually frame it as. You either reject evolution and accept Islam, or you accept evolution and reject Islam. Okay, so this is the only way that people see it, and unfortunately, that's not a very helpful way of understanding this territory. Right? There's a range of discussions that need to be taken into consideration before one can arrive at an educated opinion. So I think it's very, very important to realize that we shouldn't think in this either or narrative. Unfortunately, New Atheism, people like Richard Dawkins, they've done a fantastic marketing job in even convincing religious folks that you have to be one or the other. You can't be in between, right? So keeping that in mind, we also need to be careful is that having simplified, dismissive answers isn't going to help anyone. Resorting to labels like this is kufr or kafir is also very unhelpful, right? We need to be very, very open in understanding what is the discussion about, where exactly these complexities are coming from, and therefore realizing that this is inherently an interdisciplinary discussion. What this means is that you need to be familiar to some extent with the science. You need to be familiar some sense with theology or philosophy, and you need to be familiar with, to some extent, with Quran and Hadith. If you lack familiarity with either one of those, automatically your filter is quite narrowed because you don't understand the entire variable that exists within this conversation. So just keep an open mind in terms of how to go about this. Now, I'm not saying that evolution is 100% true or Quran and Hadith is absolutely clear cut. I'm saying understand the nature of this discussion. In the interface of science and Islam, you are looking at various fields that are going to partake in this discussion, okay? Now, as I've mentioned before, so this is now moving now where we need to step it into these different domains. I have generally found it beneficial to zone it down to 3 different areas. 1 is the science, 2 is the philosophy, theology, and 3rd is scripture. And I just want to quickly review each of these one by one, right? Now, for those of you who need a reminder, we have a Q&A session after I explain the science. So, feel free to lock and load your questions with the panelists. Now, I have actually done a whole segment on this. We had a conference last year with my institution that's available online, and the panelists will share that link with you. So for more information, I did a whole hour worth of just what the science of evolution is. So please do look into that. This is a summary. This is just a very basic summary, right? Now, let's just first talk about what are the main principles of evolution. Number 1, evolution tells us, or rather science in general tells us, that we weren't here, Earth didn't exist for just a few thousand years. Earth existed for a very long time, and life also existed for a very long time. The first life form, as long as our science can extend into, is basically saying that we had the first life form, as far as we can detect, about 3.5 billion years ago, okay? And that's the first principle. So we have something called time, like a long time of life. That's the first thing that evolution suggests, that life has existed for several years, beyond 1,000 years. It's in the billions, okay? Point number 2, as I mentioned before, evolution tells us that all biological species are connected by a historical lineage. So if we keep going back in time, humans were a product of something else before them, right? So, and this is the main principle that is problematic, because of that conflict which you see with the Quranic narrative that Adam was created instantaneously, and generally people have believed that he cannot be a product of evolution because he was a miraculous creation. And point number 3, that evolution tells us that the mechanics of evolution, so this is how evolution occurs, over this 3.5 billion years, it is basically a game of survival, right? So in every locality that species exist in, they are going to have, they need to have certain things in order to be able to survive. So for instance, if an animal or if a species has thick fur, right, because they're used to living in cold places, if you relocate them into a hot country, they will either die out or a few of them will be left at best, right? Because they're not fit for that environment. So that's what we mean by natural selection in very, very simple terms, that nature will select who gets to survive in a given environment, right? So that's the first thing. The other thing is random mutation. Over a period of 3.5 billion years, right? Eventually, our biology goes through a lot of different changes. One of them is, as you know, parents have kids in all species. As parents have kids, sometimes there are errors in how the genes are transferred from parents to kids. Sometimes the genes are mutated because of X-rays or what have you. But fundamentally, the point here is that the genes, the changes in the genes over a long period of time explains our biodiversity that we see in the world and in through our history, okay? So random mutation simply means that these genes sometimes change for whatever reason. Scientists don't necessarily have all the reasons in front of them. They're still discovering those things. But fundamentally, these mutations are random, and these random mutations and natural selection are the mechanics which govern the process of evolution. This is broadly a summary of the principles of evolution. So 3 things. 1, life has existed for a very long time. 2, we are all connected. Everything is biologically connected by historical lineage. And number 3, natural selection and random mutation govern the process. These are the 3 distinctive propositions that govern what we understand of evolution. Okay, so this is principles done. The next thing, are the evidences. What is the evidence that governs evolution, right? Now, this is a whole field in of itself. There are actually 20 different lines of evidence, even more than that, because of distinctive disciplines that have emerged through the process of our understanding these things. I'm only going to go over 2, right? I'm only going to go over 2 just for the sake of simplicity. Like I said, in the link that the panelists will share with you, there's a whole lecture that I've done on this, which I go through in detail, inshallah, and you can watch that in your own time. The first one is the fossil record. So in very simple terms, as we drill deeper into the ground, the deeper we go, the older the stratum gets. That means, so if you want to go really far back in time to see how the conditions were like, you have to drill really deep into the ground. And what we've noticed as we drill down the ground, right? I'm using very simple language here, but as we uncover more of the ground, we notice that there are fossils that are preserved in the stratification of the earth. The more recent the fossil, that means the more closer in time it is to us. The deeper those fossils are found, the further back in time it is. And what we see, broadly speaking, is that there seems to be an increasing level of complexity. So species that existed, let's just say 3.5 billion years ago, to 1 billion years ago, to 500 million years ago, to now, you can see some kind of eventual progression, right? And this gave us the first insight, possibly, that perhaps there is something going on that connects later species with older ones. Because if you want to explain how this is emerging, how this is going down, the best explanation seems to be is that the later species are a derivative of these earlier ones. So to give you one example, there is an interesting species called the Pachycetus, right? Now, Pachycetus was a species that was found in Pakistan. That's why it's called Pachycetus, interestingly. This was an animal that was semi-aquatic. So it used to be sometimes on land, sometimes in the water, right? And we saw this species, when we compare to other fossils that have been found to be very identical to it, it actually leads us to the whale. And this progression, you can see it in the skulls, you can see it in the fossils, that it begins to shape out, it begins to elongate, and the mouth begins to widen because of the mouth of the whale. So with this increasing size and increasing shape, they have been able to determine that this was a possible precursor to the modern whale, right? So, and there are many other examples. We have an evolutionary record of horses, of bees, of bacteria, and what have you. Basically, that's the general idea, that in the fossil record, As we go back in time, we begin to see simpler fossils. As we go to the earlier layers of Earth, we begin to see more complex species. And generally speaking, that is an insight which we get from the fossil record to show that evolution has occurred. The second one is genetics, right? And genetics is basically, this is your DNA. And if we are all biologically connected, we can actually use our DNA to determine how far or similar we are to a certain species. Some of you must have heard that, you know, we have a 98% similarity to chimps, right? So that has grounding in how genetics is done. And as we uncover more about some of these gene sequences, which is basically in very simple sense, how people have been able to identify the specific components of the genes. Because remember, your DNA is a very long sentence. Think of it like a sentence, right? And we can actually see where these specific words are in the sentence. Now, if we can look at other genes coming from other species, we can see how these things change that led up to the human gene. So this is what I mean by genetics in a very, very simple sense, okay? So we have the fossil record, which is as you go down into Earth, you uncover earlier and, and simpler fossils of earlier species. Genetics is basically a historical evidence which we use to explain how we match up to other species out there. Now, individually, these may be understood as weak evidences, but when there are many lines of evidences that finally converge to the same point, this is what gives evolution its impetus. That's where evolution gains strength. That over several lines of evidence, fossil record being one of them, genetics being one of them, when you put it all together, evolution seems to be the best explanation that this is the process that governs our biodiversity. So that is, in a nutshell, you know, what the evidence is, and I previously talked about the principles. So I'm now going to hand it over to the chair again, so that the questions can be brought forward.
Thank you, Dr. Shoaib. Just wanted to apologize as well at the start that I had missed out reading out your bio, so I do apologize. And I'd just like to give everybody who's viewing a chance to actually hear about your background, because, you know, you've given some really in-depth and really interesting information. So just to tell you a bit about Dr. Shoaib, that I had omitted from the start, but he graduated with honors in his undergraduate program from the University of Bath in 2010. And afterwards, he was awarded a fully funded PhD scholarship in chemistry and chemical engineering at the University of Nottingham, which he completed in 2015. And on completing his scientific studies, Dr. Shoaib decided to pursue further studies in Islamic theology and philosophy under a few shuyookh, and recently finished his MSc of Philosophy of Science and Religion at the University of Edinburgh, and currently holds a position of Assistant Professor of Natural Sciences at Zayed University in Dubai. So we're really grateful to have you, and thank you so much for giving us that introduction. So we've had a couple of questions come through. Right. The first one is, what is the definition of a species?
Right. As a very, very general starting point, the definition of a species is, let's just say, you know, you have a given population of species X. Let's call it species X, right? Now, over time, a segment of that population will begin to evolve due to natural selection and mutation. And when that species or that subset has evolved to such an extent that they can no longer mate with the original population, so they cannot reproduce with one another, that is the broadest definition or the starting point for species. That when a species is something that is isolated, that they are able to reproduce, and they cannot reproduce with other species. Generally speaking, that's what it is. Are there contentions over the definition? Yes, no doubt. Some scientists have said that that's maybe too limited of a definition. Maybe there are other ways of looking at this, and that is there and available in the literature. No doubt about that.
Thank you very much. Next question we've got is, what is DNA?
So in very simple terms, DNA is the most fundamental unit that governs your biology, right? The language that is usually used and associated with DNA is that it governs how you will look like. So for example, there's a part of your DNA that will inform the body or inform the cells in your body how your hair will look like, what color your hair will be, what color your eyes will be, and what have you, right? So the DNA, once it's there and it's fixed, it will then express and then be able to translate that information into the physical person you are. So you see the hair that I have, my DNA has coding to give me that black hair color, right? If I tweak some part of the DNA, I may have brown color, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's what the DNA is in a very simple sense.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section. So, Dr. Shoaib, if you'd like to continue and introduce the second part of the interdisciplinary problem.
Okay, great. So now that we have covered the science, right? Like I said, that was a very simple overview. Please do check out the conference that we did where I went into more details. We now have to also entertain some of the philosophical and the theological challenges that govern the context of evolution, right? Because many people, and I've heard, in my experience, I have sat down with academics, I have sat down with shuyookh, I have sat down with scientists, and I've listened to all of them. Empathetically, I've tried to be as sympathetic and empathetic with all of them to understand where they're coming from, right? Now, some of the things that I've been told is that, is evolution, for example, atheistic, right? Doesn't evolution mean that atheism is true? Another contention that I hear is, it doesn't, because of random mutation, does that mean that we are products of chance, and therefore God is doing a trial and error, right? That's some of the connotations that come out of evolution. Another question that usually comes to people's mind is, well, isn't evolution a naturalistic explanations of things, right? So do we really need God anymore if evolution is true? So that's these are the kind of areas. And the fundamental thing that I think we need to kind of ask is, of putting aside scripture for now, is it possible for God to create Adam and humans through evolution? Is it possible? Given what we know as Muslims about who God is, what he's capable of doing, can we answer the question, is it possible for God to create Adam through evolution? And overwhelmingly, the answer is yes. If he wanted to, he could create Adam like that, in front of me, literally, if he wanted to, miraculously. But also, it's possible for him to have created Adam or humans through the process of evolution. I'm talking about possibilities right now. I'm not talking about whether it actually happened or not. Just possibilities, right? So that is the first thing. The evolution, whether it's possible for God to do, it is. There's no problem theologically for us to accept the possibility that evolution occurred through the power of God. No problem whatsoever. Now, the second question here, is nature all there is? This is a general criticism that's usually leveled against evolution. They believe that if you can explain the origins of life naturalistically, then we don't need God anymore. But this is a very problematic way of criticizing evolution. And here's why, right? We are taught in schools about things like protons, electrons, we're talking about forces and what have you, right? We don't necessarily say that that's it. We don't necessarily say that electron is all there is. We know for a fact that God is always operating these things. How he's operating them is what science informs us, right? So when we talk about electrons, when we talk about engineering, when we talk about airplanes flying, we know how the science works, but ultimately who's allowing these things to work? It is God. So evolution does not necessarily have anything inherent or specific to it that makes it naturalistic. Every theory in science is naturalistic because the scope of science is to explain things of the natural world. This is something even our ulama understood, that science has a scope, just like everything else has a scope, right? The function of science is to explain how the natural world operates. That's it. So if you want to criticize evolution because it is naturalistic, then you have to shoot down everything else as well, including the mobile phones that you use, the laptops that you use. All of those are explained naturalistically. But just because they have a natural explanation does not mean necessarily that it has no supernatural explanation. As Muslims, we always believe God governs the universe with laws that he has instilled, and science just discovers those laws. Number three, are we products of chance, right? So now this is one of those things that where people have this misunderstanding of what chance is. Now, when I flip a coin, I know logically speaking, when I flip a coin, it can only land either in heads or tails. That should be crystal clear, right? Now, but when I toss the coin on a specific toss, I will not know for sure which way it will land. But does that mean God also does not know? Of course not. we may have things that have a chancy nature to them in front of us. Like, for example, when we toss coins 10 times in a row, we can talk about things in probabilities that maybe out of every 10 times, you'll get one heads. We talk about probabilities all the time. But just because we don't know the specifics of a specific mechanism and we talk about things in a chance-like way, it does not necessarily mean that God operates in a chance-like way. The confusion happens is when we put our perspective as God's perspective. Remember, God is all-controlling. He is all-knowing. So just because a specific theory, right, is operating on a chance-like basis, does not necessarily mean that God doesn't know what he's doing. Does not necessarily mean that he had no purpose, right? It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means that God has decided to create a specific law that is on a chance-like basis. What's wrong with that, right? So the point here is that chance existing in nature does not undermine God's activity. It doesn't at all, in any shape or form. If chance was an issue, then we have to even reject the idea of coincidences. I mean, that whole vocabulary will have to be lost in our conversation. Even the idea of a coin toss will be considered haram. Do you see my point? So the idea of chance governing nature is not something that is alien or problematic in Islamic thought. Finally, number 4, is evolution atheistic? It doesn't have to be atheistic in any shape or form. Atheists believe that the natural world is all there is. Generally speaking, not all atheists believe that, but generally speaking, that nature is all there is. Whereas we believe we have nature and nature is governed by God. So just because we have an explanation that is, based on our scientific understanding of things, it does not in any shape or form undermine God's existence. If they want to say that it equates to atheism, well, they are actually promoting naturalism, not atheism. They're saying that evolution is equal to naturalism. Whereas, as I mentioned before, any scientific theory is an explanation of the natural world. So the idea that evolution or any science generally is equal to atheism is not a right point of entailment. It is an absolutely false equation to say that atheism and science are equal to one another. Muslims have done science, non-Muslims do science, right? So there must be something that they have in common, which is their ability to understand the natural world. But what they believe governs this universe are two different things. So evolution does not have to be atheistic. So I hope I've answered and addressed some of those concerns. Like I said, feel free to throw in your questions. We have a segment coming up where you can ask those questions. Now, scripture. Now, this is the main part where people have issues with evolution, right? I was supposed to put the verses there. I apologize, but I felt that it was going to be a little bit too cluttered because there are many verses that are relevant for the discussion of evolution. But primarily speaking, these are enough to kind of start off with. As I mentioned before, we all know, I think all of us, when we were young Muslims, we were told about the story of Adam, right? Adam was created, and then the angels looked at this creation and they said, are you going to create something that's going to cause bloodshed? Like we know that narrative. And then, Allah asked the angels to bow down, and, the angels bowed down, but Iblis didn't bow down. And so then we had that whole thing about, Iblis saying that I am better than him. And then we know about the trial of Adam in heaven, right? We believe that he was created in his garden in heaven. And, he ate from that tree, which he wasn't supposed to. And then he then made repentance alongside his wife, Hawa. And then they were expelled from that heavenly garden and dropped down on earth. That's the general narrative, right? There are several places in the Quran where this is discussed. This is one example that I've shared with you, Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 30 to 39. So do check that out. Okay, so that is one area that causes some kind of friction between evolution and Islam. And the other, and I think this is the most important verse. In my research, all the verses are generally manageable, but the one verse that is so difficult for most evolutionists is this one here, number 2. Now, the similitude of Adam and Jesus. There's a verse in Surah Imran, in verse number 59, where Jesus is compared to Adam alayhi salam, right? And there's a reason why that's done. Surah Imran, surah number 3, is a surah that criticizes the doctrine of Christianity, right? And specifically in that surah, it's basically criticizing the idea that you consider Jesus to be divine just because of a miraculous creation. Well, here we have Adam. Here we have Adam, who should be more miraculous. Who should be even more miraculous because Adam was created without any parents. That has been the general interpretation of that verse. So if you want to have an evolutionary friendly reading in the Quran, that is one sticky verse to get around, okay? So generally speaking, these are the two primary areas where Islam and evolution conflict with one another, right? It's this story of Adam, number one, and this analogy that's usually created between Adam and Jesus in Surah Al-Imran, which is trying to criticize the Christian understanding that Jesus is divine because of his miraculous creation. The Quran is trying to refute that, and one way of refuting that is by saying that, look, if you consider that guy to be divine, well, what do you say about Adam, who was born without a mother and without a father? Because remember, in the Quran, Jesus, even Christians, they know this, that he was born without a father, right? He was born without a father. Well, if he's born without a father, that doesn't necessarily entail he's God, right? Look at Adam. He had no mother and no father, but that doesn't mean he's God either. So the idea here is that there's nothing special about Jesus because of Adam being born without parents. And that's why these verses are generally the most problematic ones. So I'm going to leave that there. So that's my broad overview of the scriptural side of things. So I'm going to hand it back over to Ali so that he can hopefully address some questions.
Many thanks, Dr. Shoaib. Some really, really interesting points there.
Yeah.
I like how you brought in the comparison between Adam and Isa alayhi salam.
Right.
That was something that I hadn't actually considered. It's definitely a very interesting point. So just a couple of questions that have come through. So one person's asked, what does evolution say about human beings in that how did they necessarily come into existence? As in, if they came from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys that are around?
Oh, okay. So I think that's an excellent question. And I think many people think that. So I think there's that common figure, the trope where you have monkeys and then it's eventually building up to the human beings. So that is actually a false understanding of evolution. Evolution does not say that we come out of monkeys. In very simple terms, evolution simply says that there was a common ancestor. Like think of a great grandparent. Think of a very great grandparent, right? That great grandparent was like a proto-human being or some kind of precursor to the human being. And there was something that led to a split, right? So he had two kids. One side of the branch of that family that he started off started evolving towards chimps and monkeys. Another branch started evolving towards human beings, right? So it's not that monkeys we are products of monkeys in the process of evolution. Monkeys are our you can say very distant cousins because we come from the same great grandparent. That's what the theory of evolution says. Now the idea here is why why are they still around? Well, there's no problem if something that has evolved in an initial species to coexist. Absolutely no problem. So even let's just say that we have monkeys in the beginning, okay, or some kind of species in the beginning, and a part of the species has evolved, they can still coexist. Not all the species evolve. Only a population or some kind of segment of the initial amount of species evolve. So that means that the parent species, the one that gave the offspring, can equally coexist. And there's no conflict with that whatsoever in science about this issue. So I hopefully address that to the adequacy of the individual.
Thank you very much. We've got another question. So just because simple fossil structures were found, that doesn't necessarily mean that a fish or an animal evolved into a higher one and then another higher one. So in a sense, it's questioning the idea of current evolutionists assuming that there was this constructive evolving process. How would you respond to that?
Like I said, there are different lines of evidence that help us understand evolution, right? Now, I didn't quite understand. Is the idea here that that there's no that it's presumed that they're evolved? I didn't quite understand the question.
I think it was more a critique of the continuity of evolution in a sense.
Oh, right. Okay. So I think that, like I said before, if you look at just the fossil record, you could say, okay, one explanation is that evolution has occurred. But you could easily say that, hang on, these were just maybe God could have created this species at this point in time, that species at a different point in time. We are just seeing it in a continuous fashion. That is a completely valid criticism, right? However, as I mentioned before, evolution relies on many lines of evidence. I've only covered two, and very briefly here, very, very briefly. There's biogeography, there's homology, there's genetics, and whatever have you. And when you put it all together, it is hard to understand how you can explain all of that in the absence of evolution, particularly genetics. What finally convinced me was genetics, right? So that's what I'm saying, that in order to be able to address and say that this is false, you wouldn't need to just discredit fossil record. You would need to discredit all these other lines of evidence that exist. So that's where I think that what gives us the impetus to believe that evolution has occurred is because of the different lines of evidence. For those of you who are familiar with hadith studies, right? If we have different isolated hadiths that have the same kind of message, but maybe different chains or different wordings, when you put them all together, scholars have no problem saying, okay, the content of these hadiths, even though they may be individually weak, add up. And therefore, the status of that message raises in rank, in evidential rank. Hope that answers the question.
We're just going to have one more question on this particular section.
Yeah.
Question here. So it states that if Adam was created from earth or clay, could that allude to an evolutionary process that has occurred in which Allah is the creator and the allower of?
Right. So this is an excellent question. So there are, as I mentioned, because of time, I didn't want to mention all the relevant verses. Some of the verses that are relevant to discussion is about where Adam is created from earth. This is spread throughout the Quran, right? Now, it's plausible just on those verses to maybe say, okay, maybe God is talking about a historical process, right? Where he probably took these cells or amino acids, put them together, started off life, and then eventually it led to the product of Adam, a human being. It's plausible just based on those verses. But you have to interpret verses not just in isolation, but in part of the larger structure of the Quran and the relevant hadiths. Otherwise, anybody can drive anything if they read the Quran too atomistically, right? Now, I'm not saying that this is what the individual is doing. I'm just saying that this is the problem when you just focus on verses individually, independently. The problem with that is that we know from the several verses that, Adam was created in heaven, right? So that's a general interpretation that all of us, I think, are quite familiar with, where Adam was created in heaven and then he was sent to the garden and then he was expelled from the garden. So if you want to say that those verses are referring to an evolutionary progress, well, what about this whole event, this chunk of the Quran that exists here, okay? In addition to that, how are you going to explain that analogy between Adam and Jesus? What is the alternative explanation of that verse? That is a very difficult thing to get around or to kind of fully accommodate evolution into the Quran and Hadith. That's what I was saying.
Thank you again. We're going to have one more question.
Right.
And the question comes here is, are we currently evolving? Have changes been happening over the last few generations? And how will humans manifest in the future? And what will be the determining factors of that?
Right. Okay. So thank you very much for that question. I think that's a really good question. And personally, when I first so by the way, I hate biology. I'll be frank. I hated biology. Still hate biology. Dropped it in GCSEs. Dropped it at A levels. And then, subhanAllah, to my surprise, I stumbled upon biology when I was doing chemical engineering. The first semester, I was shocked why I needed to learn biology. Anyways, putting that aside for a second, when I went this question about is it possible that we can convert into another species? Theoretically, yes, but the problem is that there needs to be a few principles in place for humans to convert. One of them is that the population size needs to be at a certain amount. We are 8 billion, so it's going to be a bit difficult. In addition to that, we need to be put into environments which are radically different to what they are right now, right? That hasn't happened. If you want to know further information about some of the principles which will which could allow the possibility of us evolving into whatever others. Of course, this requires billions of years. First of all, you need several years down the line to be able for that to happen. But there's a really good book by Francis Fukuyama, no, Douglas Fukuyama, that you can refer to. It's called Evolution. It's by Douglas Fukuyama and Kirkpatrick. So I recommend that. The other book I recommend is Biology by Campbell, right? So sorry, Campbell Biology, that's the name. It's the 11th edition, that's the most recent one. And that's a great starting point into looking at this. But the particular thing that you want to look at is the Hardy-Weinberg principle. So definitely check that out, inshallah. That will hopefully be much more informative. I've tried to keep this as simple as possible because I don't want to go into technicalities.
Jazakallah khair again. Just to let everybody know as well, I've seen some really, really interesting questions come through, and apologies I couldn't get through all of them. We do have one more question time period in the allotted time that we've got for Dr. Shoaib's talk, but just to also let everybody know that after the talk has ended, we have an extra 15-minute Q&A session with Dr. Shoaib. So if I haven't got around to being able to select all your questions now, we'll be able to do so in the optional Q&A and hopefully in the next session. So please keep putting your questions forward. There's some really interesting ones coming out here. I'm going to hand back over to Dr. Shoaib now for the third part.
All right. Thank you, Ali. So now that we've kind of covered the different disciplines, and like I said, I have greatly simplified this. In fact, I have a course coming out where we actually look into each of these quite extensively. So please forgive me if we resort to simplicity, but that's the nature of this particular webinar. Now what I want to do, now that we've covered some ground about the different dimensions of this discussion, I'm just going to give you just a snippet of the spectrum that exists out there, right? We have three broad categories. So one is, people wholeheartedly accept evolution. They have no problem with this whatsoever. People wholeheartedly reject evolution, right? So that extreme also exists. And then there are people in between who say we can accept, but we don't have to accept everything, but we don't have to necessarily reject everything either. So they fall in between. And I'm going to go over two, representatives of each camp for this particular section. Bismillah. Right. So this is Dr. Rana Dajani. She's a colleague. She's a friend. Mashallah, I have huge amounts of respect for her. One of the most sweetest people you will ever meet if you get to know her. Dr. Rana is a molecular biologist. She's at the University in Jordan. And she's, a huge advocate of science literacy. She's done a lot for the Middle East, mashallah, right? She wholeheartedly believes in evolution, okay? So she takes the science as it is, has no problem with it. But her approach of trying to reconcile with the Quran is as follows. Now, I want to make sure I'm clear here. I am not necessarily advocating that these positions are correct. What I'm simply stating is how they have arrived at their position. So I just want to make sure that is clear, right? So now, going back to Dr. Rana, she believes in evolution. There's no problem with it. Human beings are no exception. They are part and parcel of the evolutionary process. Okay, fair enough. Now, how about the Quran and scripture? So her approach is that we should not be treating the Quran as a scientific book, okay? So if the Quran is fundamentally not a scientific book, then how can we say that something conflicts with science or not from the Quran, right? So, so in our opinion, the Quran is simply a book about purpose. It gives you a purpose, and it gives you an ethical and moral framework. That is its function. That is the function of the Quran. So in that sense, then there is no, conflict. And all the stories that we find about Adam and what have you, they're just metaphorical, okay? Now, what I am going to do is, I will mention critiques, but I think I'll leave that in the Q&A, right? So just to simplify, her approach is, we believe in evolution. Quran is not a book of science. Therefore, the stories about Adam and what have you are metaphors, or they're just stories. They don't have necessarily reality to them, but they're just stories, right? And they may or may not have occurred, but it doesn't necessarily conflict with the science. So that is her perspective. If you want to ask me about the critiques of each one of these will have critiques, by the way. So just ask me that in the Q&A. I'm just trying to just go through the different representatives. Then now we have Dr. Nidal Gossom. He is, one of the biggest guys right now in Islam and science. He wrote a book called Islam's Quantum Question. He's a colleague. He teaches He's a physicist, sorry, an astronomer. He teaches at the American University of Sharjah. His perspective is simply that evolution is a scientific fact, right? So we cannot budge on that. The science is quite clear on this. And he now given that, how does he approach Quran Hadith? So he says he adopts something called the no conflict principle, that whatever we know from science, it can never conflict with Quran and Hadith. Why? Primarily because both what we know of the world and what we know of Quran and Hadith, both of them are products of God. God created the Quran, God created the world. So how can there be a conflict between the two? So that's his first principle. The second principle that he says to kind of address evolution is that we need to avoid literalism. So we have to avoid taking things literally. So that's slightly similar to what Rana was saying about, not taking these stories literally on face value. We have to interpret it metaphorically or non-literally. So that's his second principle. Number three, his principle is that we need to be able to cater for multiple kinds of readings for any given verse, right? We have to stop assuming that this verse has just one meaning or this theme has just one meaning. There's several ways we need to kind of address that. And what's very novel about Dr. Nadal in comparison to Dr. Rana is that he adopts this very interesting narrative of the insan and the bashar. Now, for those of you who don't know Arabic, very simply put, the Quran uses, sometimes synonyms or words that are very similar in meaning, but also very distinct, right? And the word that the Quran uses, or classical Arabic uses for, referring to human beings is insan. This is the same word that even we use in Urdu, but also bashar, okay? So bashar is something that is used to refer to human beings, and insan. Now, Dr. Nadal relies on the work of an individual known as Muhammad Shahrur, who is a very famous guy in the Middle East. And basically, the narrative goes as follows. They're saying is that whenever the word bashar is used in the Quran, it's always to do with the physical side of things, right? It's either to do with walking, with eating, with sleeping, or what have you, right? Whereas insan is always used when the topic is about abstraction, mentality, intellect. So perhaps insan and bashar in the Quran are referring to different things or emphasizing different things. So to be clear again, bashar referring to things that are mostly about the physical side of things, sleeping, eating, walking. And insan is mostly referred to when things are being discussed on the topics of mentality, abstract thought, and intellect. Now, so fundamentally, they use this division between these two based on the Quran, and they say whenever insan is being used, this is referring to Homo sapiens or humans. But whenever bashar is used, it may refer to pre-human species. Do you see my point? So they're saying that whenever the bashar is prominent in the Quran, maybe it's not talking about human beings. Maybe it's talking about these non-human beings that were precursors, like, it may be Neanderthals or what have you, but it's a pre-human entity possibly, or just the category of Homo, right? Homo is a specific term in biology, which refers to the broad category within which entities like human beings and Neanderthals come under. So it's not restricted to human beings, it's a broader category. And so he says that that's plausibly a way in which we can provide an evolutionary reading of the Quran. So just to recap, evolution is a scientific fact. We can't compromise that. We have to adopt a no conflict principle. So between science and between Quran, there should never be a conflict because both of them are from God. Number two, we have to avoid literalism. Number three, we have to cater for multiple readings when we have evidence to do so. Finally, with the insan and bashar refer to two slightly different entities, which may allow for a possible evolutionary reading. Okay, so these are the two individuals that completely, wholeheartedly accept evolution. Both of these are scientists, and they come from different backgrounds. Dr. Nadal is an astronomer. Dr. Rana is a biologist. Now I want to focus on people who reject evolution, right? These are people who completely reject. Now, for those of you, if you're as old as me, probably, you may have heard of this guy. He is very famous, right? Harun Yahya. He is definitely one of the biggest people out there who wholeheartedly wholeheartedly reject evolution. And he's written, thousands of books. It's available online. You can check him out on his website. And basically, he has several things that he discusses about evolution. One, he believes the science is problematic. Two, he believes that evolution is just atheism. It's just atheism garbed up as science. Three, the origins of evolution is the founder of evolution was a pagan, right? So Charles Darwin, or he was an atheist. So why do we need to adopt what atheists lead to, right? And number four, he also believes that evolution is problematic because it jeopardizes our morality, right? So to give you an example of why it's problematic, he basically says that if we're just people of survival, if our evolutionary history is just about survival value, and if people did things in the past, that's what might make it natural. So for instance, some people will have an issue with evolution because some of our ancestors, Neanderthals or what have you, they may have practiced certain things which we consider haram, like for example, I don't know, killing offspring, or marrying your own daughter, or what have you. They may have done their own things, right? So that if that is the scientific basis of us as our natural beings, then perhaps it may question what we consider to be natural. Perhaps it may lead to justification in why we are not necessarily moral beings. So for example, in psychology, a lot of people use evolution to justify why some people may have problems with being faithful to their partners. They will resort to these evolutionary discussions that have happened in the past. Maybe our ancestors were not faithful, therefore these particular individuals were not faithful. So you see how it kind of carries over even into morality. So these are some out of the several difficulties that he has against the theory of evolution, okay? Now I want to make sure this is clear. While Harun Yahya might have been very famous, right, and he may have amassed a big gathering, right, he also claimed himself to be a messiah, right, as in like the promised messiah, right, Messiah. Number two, he has also a TV show which is also very inappropriate, right? And number three, he is now in jail. Okay, so this guy is in jail because of a lot of scandalous and charges that have been leveled against him. So whether you want to let his affiliations and his history of these accusations against him to impact your judgment of his perspective, I'll leave that to you. But I just thought I should put that out there, that Harun Yahya has this background. Now we have Sheikh Nukeller. So Sheikh Nukeller is a very prominent theologian. He's an American who converted to Islam, and he wrote a very short article that's available online. So if you type Sheikh Nukeller, Islam and Evolution, it's probably the first thing that you're going to see. He's also published this as a book, Sea Without Shore. That's the name of the book, Sea Without Shore. It's a brown cover, and he's a chapter there on evolution, which is pretty much just copy pasted from that article online, right? Now he is against evolution. Now, but he makes a very important distinction, guys. I think is important here, right? He says we need to make sure we understand that there's on the one hand human evolution, and then there's non-human evolution. He has no problem with evolution, occurring for things like monkeys, fish, and all of that. Anything that's non-human, no problem. That can be a part of evolution. But human beings, no chance. He says no chance, right? And the reason why he says it is interesting. So he gives the following reasons, right? He has several, but these are the primary two. First of all, Allah says in the Quran on several occasions, on one or two occasions, where he created Adam with his own two hands, indicating that Adam is a unique creation. Okay, that's his line of reasoning. Number two, he believes that Adam was created in heaven, not on earth. That's the narrative that me and you have heard all the time. So how is it possible that we can reconcile this with evolution? How is it possible, right? So he's giving hermeneutic, the scriptural side of things. If you look back, let me go back here. Harun Yahya was a little bit all over the place. He was giving scientific problems and philosophical problems, right? Whereas whereas Sheikh Keller here is primarily rejecting it because of scripture. This doesn't mean he has other reasons. He does, but he's rejecting it because of scripture. Now he says evolution is kufr, i.e., if you believe in evolution, you have left the fold of Islam, right? So that's his line of reasoning. So these are the two people that reject evolution on the spectrum, right? That's their opinion. Now, finally, I'm just going to quickly wrap it up with Yasir Qadhi and Salman Jalajal. Now, Yasir Qadhi, I think most of you may know him, very prominent American scholar. I personally have a lot of love and respect for him, mashallah, right? So he believes the text does not indicate evolution at all. It doesn't do that. And because it does not indicate evolution, we have to be careful in imposing evolutionary readings onto the Quran. That we have to be careful of, right? Now, what's interesting here is that he believes that Adam was a miraculous creation, right? So he was, there up in heaven, and then he was brought down and what have you. However, and this is where it gets interesting, he says that Adam and human beings, all of them have the biology so they would all have the expected biology that evolution demands of them. So for example, if you follow the history of evolution and how things planned out, so we had, this initial, Neanderthals, monkeys, and chimps, and leading all the way up to human beings. Whatever is expected of evolution, human beings had it. Human beings had it. So when Adam came down, he had the right genetics, he had the right physiology, he had the right makeup. Okay. Now so when you look at it scientifically, it seems that there is this seamless continuation, right? So it seems like, yeah, he was a product of evolution. But in reality, the Quran is informing us that this did not happen. Now, I'm sure some of you are going to say, hang on, that doesn't make sense. So are you saying that God is deceiving us, right? I'm sure many of you will have that. He actually anticipates this question. And his response to this is simply this: science works on the presumptions of regularity. So let me be clear what I mean by that. If I have this mobile phone and I drop it, it's going to go down, right? And we know that it drops because of gravity. We know that, right? That gravity causes this thing to come down. And when we do it several times, we know that the same principle is governing this whenever I drop things down. Now, imagine for a second, if I drop it, sometimes it goes down, sometimes it goes left, sometimes it goes right, sometimes it goes up. When you don't have a uniform understanding of nature, when nature is no longer acting consistently, uniformly, then you can no longer do science, right? Because everything is out of whack. Everything has no control, has no law. So everything will be chaotic, right? So science works with the presumption that regularity is always there. Now, in the case of miracles, science cannot address miracles because miracles are non-regular things, right? They're not regularities of nature. They're irregularities of nature. So for example, when Moses, when he put his staff on the seas and the sea split up, that was an irregular phenomenon that does not follow the laws of physics that we know of, but God willed it and therefore it happened, right? So from a scientific perspective, miracles are automatically out of the equation, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that it did not happen. So what he's saying is that God tells us what has happened in light of our limited perspectives that we can get through science, okay? As an example, consider, I think most of you know this, the moon being split in the Quran, right? So I think it's in Surah Al-Qamar, if I'm not mistaken. So we know that according to a few interpretations, that he pointed his finger, the moon split in half, and then, it was attached again, right? That was a miracle that we know from the Quran, right? Now, do we have any scientific proof for it? No. NASA hasn't been able to find any cracks, right? But does that mean it hasn't occurred? So this is where he's saying that we should not limit what God is able to do according to the laws of science. The laws of science are things that he has created. So he's not bound by them. He doesn't have to be bound by them. He can, change them whenever he so feels. That doesn't mean we stop doing science. So this is what I wanted to avoid. Doesn't mean we stop doing science. We still discover, laws of nature as instilled in the universe by God. But there are these momentary things that he has implemented to show his power and show the validity of the prophets. That's the function of those miracles primarily. So that's where Sheikh Yasir Qadhi is coming from. So to cut it short and to simplify and to summarize, he basically says we don't have the Quran does not indicate evolutionary readings. It doesn't do that. We believe that Adam is a miraculous creation. However, we can still reconcile, at least from a scientific perspective, that evolution has occurred. We don't have a problem with that, because from a scientific perspective, miracles are out of the equation. And Adam and human beings had all the expected biology that they needed to kind of make it into a seamless continuation. So that's his position in a nutshell, right? Finally, the last speaker, sorry, the last representative, not speaker, David Solomon Jalajal. So I got to know David over the past few months, and I consider him a very good friend, mashallah. He's one of the sweetest guys you'll ever meet. And a very interesting thinker. I really, really liked his work. So he has a book out called, I forgot the name, but if you type in David Solomon Jalajal, Islam and Evolution, you'll find the book. It's out there. It's published by Western Cape University, okay? So check that out. He also has an article out with Yaqeen. Oh, and I forgot to mention Yasir Qadhi's position. He has published this as an article with Yaqeen Institute, so you can find that online as well. Now, David is very interesting, but he has a slight nuance that makes him somewhat different to Yasir Qadhi. So please, at this point, just pay attention. Just the last thing, and then we're done, okay? So he basically says that we believe that Adam is a miraculous creation. We're not going to compromise on that. We have enough textual indication from the Quran and Hadith to say, yeah, it has occurred. Primarily, it's the verse of analogy between Jesus and Adam. That verse is a sticky one, as I mentioned to you. So given that, how do we understand evolution? So his narrative gets really fun. He says that from the Quran, we can definitely say that Adam was created miraculously. No doubt about that whatsoever, right? You know, he was created in heaven, what have you. However, the Quran is absolutely silent on the existence of human beings on earth when he descended. Now, what do we mean by that, right? What do we mean by that? Specifically put, he's saying that the Quran neither affirms human beings existing on earth, you know, when Adam descended, neither does the Quran negate there being the possibility of human beings being on earth when he descended, okay? Now, that means you can adopt either position. So now I know this may confuse you, so let me clarify what I mean by this, right? Think of dinosaurs. We all love dinosaurs. I love Jurassic Park as much as any other individual. Some of you may dislike Jurassic Park. That's okay. It's not haram, but there you go, right? So now the Quran neither negates dinosaurs, nor does it accept dinosaurs, right? So whether you believe in dinosaurs or not has no impact on the Quran. It has no bearings on the Quran, right? Similarly, the case with the possibility of human beings on earth prior to Adam's descent. The Quran doesn't say that there were no human beings on earth when Adam descended. Neither does the Quran negate the possibility that there were human beings. It doesn't affirm nor negate. So whichever one you adopt has no bearing on the matter. So in his perspective, there could be human beings on earth, right? Adam came along from the heaven and then intermingled. No problem. So he is saying, can we accept human evolution? Yes. But can we accept Adam as a product of evolution? No. That is where he is coming from, right? That is where he is coming from. And this idea of refraining to have an opinion when the texts are silent, this is known as tawaqquf. So that's why his article in Yaqeen Institute, he says tawaqquf and human evolution. This is where what his article is called. So his proposal is very interesting, incredibly interesting, because it still allows you to believe that human evolution has occurred. So there might have been humans there, right? And Adam just popped down, and then he mingled with other human beings. The Quran neither negates it nor affirms it, so that possibility is open. That is open. So the only exception we believe is Adam. So that's the people who come under the category of partial acceptance, right? So I'm now going to open it up for Q&A. Ali, you want to take it back again so that inshallah you can take on the questions?
Yep, many thanks again, Dr. Shoaib. Some really, really interesting perspectives there, and definitely some that I personally had never really come across either. So thank you once again so much for giving us this opportunity. We just had a few questions come in, and just to let all the participants know who've submitted questions, we've had a lot of different questions submitted. Some of them have been on the topics which was covered in the previous sections of this talk. Just to let the participants know that we have actually been banking the questions, and that in the optional Q&A that is going to be taking place after Dr. Shoaib's main presentation, we will be covering those too. So if you don't hear your question answered right now, please bear with us. We will have, and we will endeavor to ensure that your question does get answered. So the first question that I wanted to bring forth to you is it the case that the dimensions and futures of much earlier humans, including prophets according to the sizes of their graves, were of much bigger proportions than now? And is that an evolutionary change?
Right. Okay. So by evolutionary change, it can simply mean a small change. So for example, you know, so evolution occurs on many scales, right? It occurs on the gene level, which is the smallest thing that governs your biology, and then on this physical level, right? So evolution can mean change in shape, change in size, change in, you know, the structure of where your organs are. It could mean any of those changes, right? Over a drastic period of time. Now, the idea of human beings very tall, this comes from a hadith, okay? This comes from a hadith where Adam alayhi salam was thought to be sitta dara'a, right? Which is 60 cubits tall, approximately in our time, 30 meters. Now, 30 meters, for those of you who want to get a reference of that, that's like, approximately speaking, you can say that a 10-story building. That's like a 10-story building height, right? Now, first of all, that hadith is going, the analysis of that hadith, there's a paper coming out by a well-known expert of hadith who will be discussing about this, about whether that hadith is valid or not. So that's one thing to put to the side. Now, the thing is, science does not permit those kind of heights for human beings because there are certain limits in how far we can grow with that height, with this anatomy and the height that we can achieve with this. So given this anatomy, human beings can only go up to a max of 3 to 4 meters tall. Anything beyond that is physically and biologically impossible and unlikely, if not impossible. So that cannot happen scientifically. Now, the only basis we have this belief that human beings were tall is that one hadith, which will be evaluated and it will be coming out in a paper. And that will be, I can't mention the name of the author because he hasn't published it yet, but yeah, well, that's all I'll say for now on that. But yeah, scientifically, it's impossible to have those heights.
Okay, many thanks again. Just moving on to the next question we have is, there was a documentary, as participants submitted this, there was a documentary suggesting that about 25,000 years ago,
Yeah.
An extraterrestrial species came down because it was suddenly noted that the human brain had suddenly increased in size as a species, which was living in the world, and that had a smaller brain size, which might explain kind of the phenomenon of Adam coming down to Earth. And basically, what is your view on this?
Right. The whole thing about aliens and and that whole thing. So I'm now saying this as a personal commentary. This is my personal belief that I'm sharing, right? I personally believe the first, so if you notice that, you know, the challenges to religion come in many forms. First, it was philosophy, right? Then it was evolution. Now I'm predicting what's the next biggest challenge to religious folks. Personally speaking, the next biggest challenge is aliens. I believe that. Because if you think of all the documentaries, the movies, and just the way that the entertainment industry is moving, aliens seem to be becoming much more predominant in the psyche of the entertainment industry. And I feel that using some kind of plausibilities, this idea that perhaps aliens were dropped down on Earth and perhaps even prophets were aliens, all of that will come about. For now, all of this is pure speculation. Like, it is completely bogus, number one. Number two, whether Adam alayhi salam came down through a spaceship, I have no clue. At best, it's speculation. I wouldn't know. Is it possible for God to bring down Adam being through spaceships? It's possible. Whether it occurred or not, I have no clue. But so that would be my take on that particular question.
Thank you. The next question we have is, why is it that in the Quran, Allah describes Adam's creation in stages, i.e. from wet sand, then hard clay, and so on, when Allah could have said kun, if evolution is in contrast to the Islamic creation story?
Right. So when Allah says kun, this is just a verbalization of his absolute power. God doesn't necessarily need to say something for it to occur. Remember, God is outside of time. He's outside of space. He's not bound by, you know, laws of nature like us. So his mechanics is totally different to ours. He doesn't need to say things for things to occur. He just wills it in however befits him, and that's it. Now, when it comes to the description of things like the egg, the womb, this is just God reminding us of our humble origins, right? That's what we can extrapolate from this. But it doesn't necessarily, I mean, we can't necessarily take that and juxtapose it with kun and saying, well, why was this necessary? It's just God reminding us of our humble origins. That's it. So that's my answer with regards to that question.
Thank you. Next question is, how come we are called sons of Adam, and when the idea that humans kind of existed before Adam came to earth,
right,
by some?
Right. So now this is where David's proposal, I'm assuming that this person is talking about David Jalaz's proposal. So basically, we know from the Quran that our lineage traces back to Adam, because we're called Bani Adam, right? Our lineage traces back to Adam. But nowhere in the Quran does it say that Adam is the first human. Where does it say in the Quran? Nowhere in the Quran does it say it. So the reason why his proposal is interesting is because he makes a disconnection between Adam being the first member of our lineage versus him being the first human being. Nowhere in the Quran does it say he's the first human being. We've generally presumed him to be the first human being. I think that has generally been thought of as like that. But the Quran and Hadith do not necessarily indicate he was the first human being on earth, right? And there's a very interesting book that I read written by a Sheikh Muhammad Nadvi. He was an Indian scholar from Bangalore. He wrote a book in which he said that perhaps possibilities, right? In Surah Al-Baqarah, where, when Adam was created and then the angels said, are you going to create another entity that is going to cause bloodshed on earth? He said, perhaps the angels, when they saw Adam, they recognized him as similar to another creation that Allah had, perhaps. And that creation was possibly causing bloodshed on earth, possibly. So you see, because in order for angels to be able to say that, they should have seen that this is maybe an entity that bore resemblance to something that was previously created. So perhaps that is an indication. God knows best. We can never be certain about that. These are plausible interpretations. God knows best.
Thank you. Just wanted to say jazakallah to all the participants for submitting all the questions thus far. We're trying to get through as many as we can. We are just focusing at the moment on the questions that are coming in about Adam alayhi salam. Just another question. We have two questions kind of linked on this theme. This idea of human age. So we kind of hear references within the scripture of prophets living for hundreds, almost 1,000 years.
Yep.
And basically the question is, why has the age of human beings suddenly gone down, in a sense? What has led to that decline? We have the Quran that talks about prophets living for hundreds of years. So in a sense, where has that decline in age come from?
Right. So whether, as far as I'm aware, scientifically, I don't think we have evidence of people living for that long. The idea that human beings have lived long, which is possible because God can do miracles, right? That comes from Quran. So for example, we know that possibly Noah lived for about approximately 1,000 years as it is mentioned, right? Now, whether that has scientific weight or not, I don't know. For me, I'm not a biologist, right? So I wanted to look into biology enough to see where the conflict comes from. And the conflict mostly comes from that we are all biologically connected. In biological terms or in evolutionary terms, this is called common ancestry, that we have an ancestor to the human species. So I didn't want to look any further than that. However, on the issue of age, I remember going through a documentary which has about telomeres. Now the telomeres are a specific unit inside our biology that possibly governs our age, right? And as you age, they get shorter and shorter and shorter. And I think there were some kind of medicine that came out or that was being tested, which you could take them and they could extend those telomeres back. That means you could possibly live longer. So that was something that I looked into. Whether that has any weight, scientific weight, I'm unsure of, but I just thought that might help address your question. Fundamentally, Allahu A'lam, I don't know.
Thank you. And final question for this part is, how long do you think human beings have actually been in existence on Earth? Sort of 50,000 years, 100,000 years? I mean, what would you say to that?
See, the thing is, this is a very difficult question to ask, right? This is a very difficult question. And the reason why it's difficult to ask is because in Quran, we have certain terminology. We have insan and bashar. Okay, that's in Quran. In science, we have different terminology. Humans, Homo sapiens. How do we know insan and bashar map onto those scientific terms? How far do we stretch it scientifically, right? Because remember, scientific categories may not necessarily overlap with our Quranic categories. So that is one question to think about, first of all. The other thing to think about when it comes to addressing this question is we are limited by the data at hand, right? So we try to understand when civilization started. Now, 20, 30 years ago, the common narrative was it was ancient Egypt, right? 3000 BC. That was the common narrative. At least that's what I heard when I was growing up. Now, we know that there was a whole new discovery in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, that seems to suggest a civilization 15,000 years ago. That's way earlier than ancient Egypt. And we know that they had a civilization is because they were able to craft these humongous rocks. That requires understanding of mathematics, craftsmanship, engineering. How did they do that, right? So as we uncover more, I feel that this question will always be revisited. Now, the interpretation that we get from science generally is that perhaps humans existed 200,000 years ago. These are estimations as far as I can tell. But between that and when we can find our earliest civilization, where we fit the category of human beings and where we could assume Adam fits on that timeline, I have no clue. God knows best about that.
Thank you very much again. So I'm going to close the Q&A for this particular slot. Many thanks again to everybody for submitting all the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get through every single one. However, we do, just to remind you, have the additional 15 minutes after this talk is over. So for now, I'm going to pass back to Dr. Shoaib to conclude. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Ali. So the take-home message, if I've been able to achieve any, if you have understood that this is a difficult topic and it is an interdisciplinary problem, I feel that this is a job done from my side, right? This was a webinar that was meant to be, that was trying to, its attempt was to try and make this conversation accessible and just to give you some kind of blueprint in how to navigate these territories, right? So given the limitations of this webinar, I hope you can appreciate, number one, that this discussion is inherently complex, right? There are things we need to take into account from all domains, right? We cannot, on the one hand, be very dismissive of the science. We will look anti-scientific and foolish, right? Muslims were never against science. We are definitely against the idea that science can explain everything, which is known as scientism. That's when we adopt science as the only way of understanding the world. Muslims don't adopt scientism. Muslims have always been open to science, right? But so that's why we need to be careful in being these dismissive folks, right? We cannot be dismissive. The other thing is, I hope you understand that Quran and Hadith also have limitations where it's fixed and some things which are open to interpretation. And I hope you were able to see that based on the spectrum of opinions that we presented today. And number three, simplicity doesn't help the discussion. If we have, I'm not saying of this any particular individual, but if we have scientists who come in and say, right, evolution is correct, therefore we need to completely reinterpret Quran Hadith, that is a sense of dismissivism, because you're completely dismissing the tools and the procedures of interpret Quran Hadith. Just like scientists have procedures, experiments to do to be able to understand whether the theory is valid or not, Quran and Hadith also has its own discipline, right? If you study usul al-tafsir, you will know that there's some principles that govern how we interpret Quran and Hadith. So we need to be fair to both sides. Scientists completely dismissing the tafsir of the Quran is one thing. And then ulama or sheikhs or imams dismissing the science as if it doesn't really matter is another thing. Both of these are very simplistic ways of analyzing a discussion. And simplicity always creates problems. Complexity always brings out the nuances and helps you appreciate how finely grained this territory really is. Finally, as I've tried to deliver, there are different opinions on the spectrum, and I have left it to you to take it upon yourselves to, hopefully through this presentation also the conference links that the panelists have sent to you, and that a link to a short document, a 6-page document that goes through even more opinions. So I wrote a 6-page piece that reviews the territory of Islam and evolution, and there's a table there covering 14 opinions, which you can look at in your own time, inshallah. So that's my presentation for today. I really hope you enjoyed it. Feel free, for those of you who have further questions, my email address is there. Feel free to contact me, and yeah, I'll hand it back over to Ali so that we can hopefully address some of the questions that you've sent us.
Jazakallah, Dr. Shoaib. That was honestly a brilliant webinar. And just as somebody who has very little knowledge of science and biology, I didn't even take GCSE biology myself. But I have to say that was something that I was really able to understand. It was very, very well thought, and the spectrum of opinions was really, really interesting. And I definitely feel that I've learned something from this. And I hope that everybody watching at home is able to walk away and have learned something. So what we're going to do now is we're going to carry on taking some more questions before concluding. So we've got just about 15 minutes where we've got a few more questions that people have asked. We've always been banking the questions that people have asked, so we get the chance to have them forward. If I could just remind people that this session is also being recorded and can be watched again. Dr. Shoaib as well, if you're able to change your screen sharing so that the ISB office now has access to it.
Yep.
So we'll just move on to the questions that we've had. So one final question on Adam alayhi salam is that if there were already humans on earth, then what was the point of creating Adam in the heavens in the first place?
So I think to question why, in terms of trying to understand God's purposes, I personally do not know. Like, for example, I ask myself, why did God create angels? He had no need to create angels. He could have controlled everything directly. Why did God create jinns, right? Now we know that in the verses that he said that he created to worship us, right? So that's one possible explanation. But do we have an explanation for everything in the Quran? Not necessarily. Why is zakat 2.5%? No alim in the world knows. Why do we pray in a very specific way? We don't know, right? So I wouldn't necessarily want to entertain why God did something, even with these things that we do have understandings of, these may be very limited explanations of why he does things. So I personally do not know why he did that. And then the point here is that David Jalal is simply stating this. I'm assuming that is a reference to David's proposal. It is simply referring a possibility. He's not saying this occurred. I want people to make sure that they understood that. He didn't say that this actually occurred. He's saying it's possible, because we have to understand when there's clarity in the Quran, we take it. When there's when there's ambiguity, we understand, okay, this is a gray area. When the Quran doesn't make any statements about something, we just have to stop. We just don't know, right? So that's what he's saying, that it's a possibility. God knows best why he did it and for what reason he did it.
Thank you. So just moving on to some of the questions that were kind of challenging the science of evolution. So one participant stated that, I've read that evolution is flawed because it doesn't explain how the wing or the eye evolved, because
Right.
these organs don't sort of half work. So they suddenly have to emerge completely all of a sudden, otherwise they're useless. So how does
right. Yeah, okay, I know this. So a common criticism that evolutionists sometimes face is that, I mean, how can you say that everything is driven by chance-like processes when we have really complex things? Like, for example, your eye, it has, it's just so complex, right? It has a retina, it has a screen, has all these things at the back, right? If you study the A-level biology, you know what I'm talking about. Now, the thing is that people who criticize evolution, right, they will say that these things cannot just have come over by chance. They're too complex to have arrived just like that, right? Now, the thing is, they're presuming that the individual components just had to come together just like that. Whereas from an evolutionary perspective, it is completely plausible, scientifically it's plausible, that perhaps those different things had different functions when they were initially created, right? So for example, if you have a tie clip, right? If you have a clip of a tie, for instance, yes. Or you could think of another use for it. Like, for example, you could think of it, for example, hanging paper. You could even break them up and use it to, I don't know, create wood or fire or something. The idea here is that individually, the components of the eye could have a different function. They could have. And then over time, they came together to create complex things like the eye. So that doesn't necessarily undermine evolution. That's the point. It doesn't undermine evolution.
Thank you. So carrying on with the topic of evolution. So I've got a couple of questions here that basically kind of critique this idea of chance within the theory of evolution. That, one person said that the evolution theory is based on kind of assumptions and not really facts. That this idea that chemicals become cells, cells become fish become mammals. And it's the idea that through this process, in a sense, is it all just based on assumption and chance rather than concrete fact?
So I think there will always be theory. Every theory has some kind of presumption. Every theory has a presumption. When you study gravity, there's presumptions behind it. When you study quantum mechanics, there are presumptions about behind it, right? The question is, what substantiates the theory? It's the evidence. The evidence kind of guides you towards a theory. Now, if you had presumptions and you put those presumptions to the test, if the data doesn't come forward, khalas, your presumption is wrong. Your presumption will be wrong, right? So the same way with evolution, the idea that the process is chancy is there. I mean, people have been able to do some tests. The references that are referred to, Campbell Biology, have a look at that book, and Evolution by Douglas Futuyama and Kirkpatrick are really good references that break it down. These are university textbooks that really break it down well. They have a lot of good graphics there that they can kind of help you. Now, is there a debate about the whole issue of chance? Perhaps that there may be other ways of explaining evolution. Yes, scientists are having healthy debates, no doubt about it. But the standard interpretation right now seems to be that it is chance-driven. And like I said, Muslims do not have an issue with chance. We don't have an issue with chance. God can create the world with chance and without chance. It doesn't undermine anything of him. So whether it's chance or not is irrelevant in my personal opinion. And God knows best.
Many thanks again. Another question we've had here is, do you think that evolution is sometimes abused by some scientists to kind of answer subjects or topics that they can't really logically explain, especially ones related to more abstract, unquantifiable things, such as morals and ethics? And in a sense, do you think that it can be misused to some degree?
Yeah. So I personally believe that evolution, and just like any theory out there, has always been to some extent misused by scientists, right? We have, for example, people using physics to say the universe came from nothing, right? Lawrence Krauss, for instance, a big physicist, he wrote a book called Universe from Nothing and believes the universe requires no creator. It created itself somehow, right? So there you go. So it's not just evolution that has this baggage. Every scientific theory has it. And we have to be careful enough to understand the distinction between what validates a scientific theory versus what is the package it is being brought under or towards us by the presenter. Atheists will sometimes use these theories to debunk religion and debunk God, but we have to understand and create that distinction between what their personal worldview is versus what the science is saying. So I hope that makes sense.
Many thanks. Moving on to another question, perhaps a little bit more of a broader question. How is Eve's, in the story of Adam and Eve, how is the story of Eve being made from Adam's third rib? How can that be explained?
Right, okay, so if that hadith was true, right, then it's just a miraculous creation. So when Adam was created and, she was created out of his third rib, what's the problem? Like I said, as Muslims, we have no problem believing in miracles. We have had no issues. So if that is being indicated by the text, okay, no problem.
Thank you. More a little bit of a personal one from me, actually, just on the board reading that I had done.
You're getting privilege, huh? So
I have to take it one time, otherwise I wouldn't be doing my job properly. I actually read a book called *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari. If you've ever come across that book at all, and his discussion on kind of how there were different ideas of human being, different kind of humans. You had Homo sapiens and others. and kind of talked about the differences that they had in DNA. But basically this idea of having already had these different species and the differences that existed, and how actually he argues that they evolved into different kind of races of human beings. How do you think that would kind of, that theory or model would fit in with the rest of the scripture that we've highlighted today?
Sorry, what specific area? What do you mean by species going into different races? I didn't quite get that.
The difference in human, in terms of, like, talks about Homo sapiens being the surviving kind of human species,
Right.
like, although there were different ones, but basically kind of how would that principle, that model fit in with the wider scripture?
Right. Okay. So I think that, as I mentioned before, Homo sapiens is a scientific term, right? And humans is an English term. How do we correlate insan and bashar with Homo sapiens? Depending on how you address that, your understanding of where we start. So, for example, us humans, where our lineage starts off with Adam, where you fit in that picture, you will have to take a huge speculative guess about that. In the absence of evidence, I think how you would go about saying that this is where humans are, this is where they started, I think these are just at best wild speculations. Okay. Now, about us being survival of the fittest, there's nothing wrong with that narrative. We, as a fundamental point of view, okay, if God created a process where survival is a necessity, well, we already do that on a daily basis. All of us who are on this presentation, right? All of us, to some extent, we have to go out and work. If we don't work, we will starve. And if we starve, we will pass away. This is a necessity of life, right? So the idea of there being a survival of the fittest is not necessarily that as antithetical to the Islamic worldview. The problem is when this principle is masked as the defining principle and worldview that Muslims have to adopt. We don't necessarily believe that survival of the fittest is what governs us. What governs us is we have morality in place, we have ethics in place, and we have these things that don't necessarily come from science. They're given to us by revelation, by God, right? So that's where I think we need to kind of balance that the understanding between the speculations of science versus our philosophical and theological background.
Okay, thank you so much for answering that. I'm going to close the question time period, and I just want to extend my sincere thanks, and on behalf of ISB, a sincere thanks to Dr. Shoaib for what has been a really interesting and thought-provoking session today. We'd just like to wish you all the best of luck with your upcoming book. I'm definitely very, very keen to buy that. Inshallah, we really hope we get the chance to host you again in the near future. Just want to say to everybody again, Jazakallah khair for coming. We hope you've all learned something and come away with a lot of knowledge. Once again, our sincere thanks to Dr. Shoaib for this, and we hope to see you again in the future. Many thanks again to everyone for tuning in. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.